Hello, everyone, and welcome to our combined Sunday school class from First Presbyterian Church here in Greensboro. We're so delighted you're able to be with us today as we gather together virtually to worship God on this Sunday, November 1st, All Saints' Day. I'm Lane Ridenhour. Sandie Gravett will be along with us in just a few moments with our Sunday school lesson as she continues her study on the book of Romans, the sixth book of the New Testament. But first, let's sing a hymn together. Our hymn today is For All the Saints Who From Their Labors Rest. It was written in 1864 by the Bishop William W. Howe. Reverend Howe was known for his work with the poor in the slums of London, and he also had a rapport working with factory workers in the area. He wrote some 60 hymns during the early years of his ministry. The theme for all the saints is that we sing to and praise God for all the saints who have finished their course here on earth and have entered into the rest with the Lord. The hymn is a commentary on the Apostles' Creed statement, I believe in the communion of saints. Within the Anglican tradition, the relationship between the faithful here on earth, the church militant, and those who've gone on, the church triumphant, is paramount. And this hymn emphasizes with that union, and it's full of imagery that's both regal and joyful. Originally, it had 11 stanzas. Don't panic, we're only going to sing 4 of them today. Also, originally, it had a different tune. For almost 50 years, it was sung to a different tune. But when 1906 rolled around and the New English Hymnal came out, lo and behold, there was a new tune to this text. And it was written by the famous English musician Ralph Vaughan Williams, who just happened to be one of the editors of the 1906 English hymnal. The title of the musical composition is Sine Nomine, which in Latin means literally without name, and it's sort of comparable to the literary term anonymous, if you will. But it's sort of appropriate in this hymn that we are talking about not a specific individual, it's not named for one, but it's named for all the saints who have both known and unknown. I'll put the words up on the screen for you, invite you to sing along as we sing For All the Saints.
The saints who from their labors rest, who thee by faith before the world confessed, thy name, O Jesus, be forever blessed. Alleluia, wast their rock, their fortress, and their might. Thou, Lord, their captain in the well-fought fight. Thou in the darkness drear, their one true light. Alleluia, blessed communion, fellowship divine, we feebly struggle, they in glory shine, yet all are one in thee, for all are thine. Earth's wide bounds, from ocean's farthest coast, through gates of pearl, streams in the countless host, singing to Father and Holy Ghost. Alleluia, alleluia.
As we continue our study of the book of Romans, we are going to look at one of the most famous passages of this letter. It sits at the heart of what we understand to be the gospel. But I'm going to ask us, how often do we really look at those words and seek to understand them? This passage is notoriously difficult grammatically, and I spent some time this week pulling my hair out trying to figure all the little nuances out well enough to explain them to you. I called on every friend I know whose Greek is far better than mine and more polished. And where I prefer to stay in the biblical materials, just thinking about the grammar and the ideas interbiblically, this passage also requires us to plumb some depths of our theology. And that means we have a big challenge laid out for us this morning. Are you ready to begin? Take a look at this passage from Romans chapter 5. It is verses 6 to 8. Look at the New Revised Standard Version. For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Indeed, rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person someone might actually dare to die. But God proves God's love for us in that while we still were sinners, Christ died for us. Now compare the New International Version. You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates God's own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And of course, who could leave out the King James Version? For when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet peradventure for a good man some would even dare to die. But God commendeth God's love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. If we are going to figure out what Paul means with these words, we need to think about three topics that may seem obvious: humanity, Christ, and God. But there is something more to it than just that. This passage is about the nexus of all three, and not simply in a linear way. These verses are, in fact, expressing interactions so complicated that we have to think about what is both on the page and what is behind that page. It may go in a direction or two that you do not anticipate. And I am going to start with some sentence diagramming in the Greek. This passage features what we might call three eddy phrases. That is, three phrases that are marked off by the small adverb that I have highlighted in the bright green here. Now I want to remind you, using a trick that my students like and that I hate, of the dictionary definition of an adverb. It is a word or phrase that modifies or qualifies an adjective, which is what's going to happen here, but it could be a verb or other adverb or a word group. And that modification expresses a relation of time or place or circumstance or manner or cause or degree. In this case, most commentators say that we have an adverb, eddy, modifying adjectives and expressing a relationship of time. But it is not so much chronological time for reasons we are going to discuss below. The three adjectives modified by these adverbs I've indicated here in the bright blue. They are weak, impious, and sinful. And there are also two subjects and two verbs, but they come in a triad. The two subjects here are marked in the bright pink, Christos, Christ, and Theos, God. And then they each have a verb associated with them. For Christ, it is the verb to die, and for God, it is the verb to demonstrate. There is also one sort of explanatory sentence that I have marked through and put in the bright yellow. It is in many ways a side thought for Paul, but I am going to discuss it, however, briefly. Now that we have this all laid out, I want to discuss the passage itself and each element in it. This passage foregrounds Christ. I do not want you to miss that fact. The grammar deliberately positions Christ as the subject from the outset in almost a declarative way, and it does it no matter how convoluted it makes the rest of the sentence. Paul, or Paul's secretary, Tertius, really does butcher this sentence in terms of creating a grammatical structure. It has puzzled grammarians for centuries. This position for Christ, and you already know that the verb associated with Christ is to die, tells us exactly what Paul has his eye on here. It's the death of Christ, and what is it accomplishing? That's the subject. Still, adverbs, and the very first thing even before Christ is an adverb, modify, in this case, adjectives. And we need to think about those adjectives because the phrasing puts the emphasis there. So we have Christ and we have these adjectives, and we've got to figure out the death of Christ in relationship to these adjectives. That's why we need to look at the adjectives next. The first of these adjectives is weakness. The Greek word here indicates some type of deficiency. It doesn't distinguish with precision what form of deficiency or what form of weakness. It could be physical. It could be moral. This word can mean sick or infirm. But I want to push the idea of without strength, as in without the resources necessary or required for the task at hand. And the task at hand for Paul is living in the eternity of God. The problem with that task, however, is the human condition. We are not eternal, a fact most of us know all too well. I want to remind you that this is a human condition which Christ shared with us. That is, do not overlook the reality of the incarnation or the reality of the weakness of his physical body, which does succumb, even in this passage, as we all will succumb to death. Paul then initially draws our eye to Christ being present with us in our human weakness. But then immediately we get that second Eddie phrase and the occurrence this time of the adjective which I translate as impious. The word literally is the negative of to respect or to reverence. It is meant to describe a person who lives unmindful of God or the things of God, that is, the creation, other created beings. As we know from previous weeks, Paul has already been talking about these folks from two directions in the letter to the Romans. We have those among the Gentiles who should have known God from the things that are made apparent about God in the created order, and we have the Jews who should know God via the covenant relationship that God establishes. But neither has been successful in their efforts to live in the eternity of God, and both have been what Paul terms here impious. Further, there is another great little feature in this second Eddie phrase. It is kata kairon, at the right moment or time. I have to stop here and talk about this. We have discussed the word kairos before and made the distinction between kairos, God's time, and chronos, or clock time, measurable chronological time. Instead of me walking you through the subtleties of that, I want to give you a quote from the writer Madeleine L'Engle. She tells us what we need to pay attention to here. It's a rather long but a stunning quote. She says, Kairos is not measurable. Kairos is ontological. In Kairos, we are. We are fully in isness. Kairos can sometimes enter, penetrate, break through Chronos. The child at play, the painter at the easel, Sirkin playing the Appassionata are in Kairos. The saint in prayer, friends around the dinner table, the mother reaching out her arms for her newborn baby are in Kairos. The bush, the burning bush, is in Kairos. Not any burning bush, but the particular burning bush before which Moses removed his shoes. The bush I passed by on my way to the brook. In Kairos, that part of us which is not consumed in the burning is wholly awake. You need to spend some time with this thought to really get it. But what she is saying to us here is that Kairos is God time, where we are present in the fully eternal. On this side of things, we get it only in glimpses. So what is Paul saying about Kairos here? Paul is arguing that the death of Christ is a Kairos moment. It is a place where the human and the eternal touch. I want you to pay attention to the fact, however, that it doesn't say Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. This passage is not about the actual crucifixion per se. Yes, Jesus of Nazareth was sentenced to die by the Romans for sedition or disturbing the peace during the Passover or whatever pretext it was that they ginned up. Yes, they beat him, they mocked him, they marched him through the streets, they hung him on a cross. The text is not about those details. It is rather about putting the focus on the Christ of God, the Messiah of God, an eternal figure, and experiencing in a very human moment an eternal change. That is, you can watch the actual crucifixion unfold and miss what is happening simultaneously. You can miss the fact that the relationship between God and Christ and humanity is irrevocably, eternally changing. Paul chooses to take a bit of a breather at this moment, and who can blame him? He wants to tell you about just how remarkable he thinks this death is. Thus he shifts into somewhat of a small side sentence to talk about what giving one's life entails. He's going to make the argument that it is scarce that for a righteous person anybody is going to die. Though maybe we can conceptualize a situation where someone would determine that this person is good and hence I am going to give my life for them. What does he mean here? Paul is not diverting our attention to make us think about what situation would you give up your life for. Rather, he is pointing out that humans don't really have the proclivity, the natural instinct to give up our lives. We rather innately have a fight or flight kind of mentality. Yes, obviously, perhaps for your children, you would fight to the death. Maybe for your spouse, you would give up your life. We certainly also know that people choose to enter professions that can put their lives on the line. I think of our military people, our first responders, our healthcare workers. These are places where you can literally have to face that choice. Paul is, however, making an argument here. He is saying that in general, in human life, we do not tend to say, yeah, I am willing to put my personhood, myself, my life out there on the line for this individual. I don't naturally give up or give in that way. And he's also pointing out to us by using the categories of righteous and good that there is a judicial element to it. In other words, is that person's life in a balance worth me giving up my life? Is it something that I would say, yeah, that's a good equation. That's a reason for me to step forward. By doing this, what Paul is focusing on is that Christ's death is extraordinary precisely because there isn't this kind of negotiation happening. It is a decision to die completely independent of someone's righteousness or goodness. It is a decision to die that doesn't try to judge the value of the person or persons for whom Christ is enacting this. Christ instead dies for us while we are weak, while we are impious, while we don't deserve anything from God. We have a tough time swallowing it if we are honest. And that is why Paul takes this breather to underscore it. And it is an effective bridge to the last sentence. That is a sentence where Paul talks about this death is not simply a choice that Christ makes. It is also about God, because Paul argues this death is demonstrating, it is in and of itself a demonstration of God's love for us while we were still sinners. This last adjective, the one on the bottom, the word for sinful, means falling short or missing the mark. If God is the mark, then one's aim is either off or one's ability to reach the goal is compromised. We have not been who God made us to be. When we think about these three descriptives together, weak, impious, sinful, it is not a flattering picture. It is, however, meant to demonstrate the extent of humanity's dilemma. We are not the image of God, not the crown of a created order that is very good, but rather we are separated from God and from the order in which we were placed by God. That's what we should be seeing here. I think of this piece as like a photo where we get a shot of reality. You know what I'm talking about. The picture of yourself that you look at and say, when did I get those wrinkles? Where did my hair go? When did I gain that weight? It's an image of us that should make us squirm. It confronts us with something that makes me want to take yet another step back and think it through. There is so much suffering in these words, but we have to remember to look below the surface of the familiar to see it. I want to hold on to this idea of a photograph and tell you about one I saw this week as illustration of the point I want to make. I'm not sharing the actual picture because it's not my picture to share. It was posted on the Facebook page of one of my friends. It was black and white, and a woman was sitting just off center of the frame. She had gray hair and glasses, and she was seated on a folding chair. No one else was nearby. She wasn't looking at the camera, but her attention was off in the distance, something to the side. There's nothing out of the ordinary about her neat clothes, her jewelry, her hands clasped carefully on her lap, her purse on the floor beside her. The only exceptional thing in the photo was a nod to our time. She wore a surgical mask. But this photo had a story that my friend was also telling. It was a picture of his mother. In mid-March, just weeks after my friend had visited his parents in February for his father's 90th birthday, his dad took a stumble and fell, and he broke his hip. This woman in the photo, at age 87 herself, could not manage the kind of care that her husband of almost 70 years needed. The family discussed at-home nursing, but as COVID was becoming all too real, this option turned out not to be workable. After a brief hospital stay, his father was transferred to a rehab facility, and in both locations he was tended to by caring medical professionals, but they were all dressed from head to toe like astronauts in full COVID PPE. And under quarantine, his dad was allowed no visitors. It did not go well. Isolated, alone, hurt, and confused, his father began to decline and eventually began to refuse to eat. This woman, the one sitting in the picture, his beloved wife, was forced to choose whether to allow the medical staff to let him go or to force feed him nutrition. She told her son it was the most painful and unimaginably dreadful decision she had ever had to make. "I have to decide," she said, "whether to keep him alive or let him die." That moment came 8 weeks in to the longest separation they had ever had in their marriage. They moved him to hospice care, where, in the 3 days before he passed, she was finally allowed to be with him, at least for some periods of time. She told her family that she thought she heard him whisper, "I love you," just before he died. Her hearing, however, was not so good, but the staff there told her they heard it too. This photo of her sitting alone was taken at his funeral. Because of COVID, only 5 family members could be present to mourn along with the 2 ministers from their church and a bagpipe player who played a couple of his favorite hymns. Many others would have come. He died in his hometown. It was the town where they met. It was the place they had come back to following retirement. But she sat alone to mourn the man who was taken by something as small as a stumble in a time when a virus compromised the ability of his family and the medical community to care for him. If you just saw the picture, you could miss seeing all of that suffering. But you see, it's not just her suffering. It is the suffering, physical and emotional, of her husband, of my friend, their son, and of others in the family and the community who love them. It is the suffering of the ones who took care of him in an impossible circumstance and wept for what they could not do. The suffering, in other words, reverberates. This suffering is the human condition. Likewise, we can miss seeing the suffering in the passage we are studying. We know something about human weakness and impiousness and sin. We understand the suffering that they each manifest, the suffering we endure, even though we often cloak ourselves in the illusion that we are strong and safe, comforted by the roofs over our heads, the food in our bellies, the money in our bank accounts, and the miracles of modern medicine. The weakness of our human condition, however, can hit us like a freight train when we least expect it. It can hit us in ways that make us all too aware that we are ultimately, all of us, vulnerable to the kinds of forces that can wipe everything else away, even our lives. And we know something about impiousness, seeing the world and wondering if God has abandoned us or if we have abandoned God. How do we hold on to belief to the idea of God in a world where disease and human cruelty and natural forces take life seemingly without any consideration? How do we remain reverent in a scientific age? And we know something about sin. We know something about being separated from God, whether it be in living through the consequences of poor choices that we and others make, or whether it be consigned to living a life that is out of balance at its core. That is, the idea of being born into a world that is itself sinful. So when we look at this picture in this passage, we get that we are talking about human suffering. But we also often sometimes talk about the suffering of Christ, the one who took on human form and endured a brutal death. Here is a God who is suffering like us and with us, we say. But when we focus on this suffering Christ, we can get caught up all too easily solely on the physical reality of his suffering. Theologian Jürgen Moltmann, however, stops us from making that mistake. He reminds us of something more to this suffering when he writes these words. When God becomes human in Jesus of Nazareth, God not only enters into the finitude of humanity, but in his death on the cross also enters into the situation of humanity's God-forsakenness. The suffering in the passion of Jesus is abandonment, rejection by God, his parent. What Moltmann is trying to communicate here is the suffering of Jesus is about being totally alone, precisely because he dies not just as a convicted criminal and outcast, but also because he experiences the abandonment of God. He dies pleading to God, wondering why this God has forsaken him. He is dying in a place where God is absent to him. And it is that fact that opens us up to yet another layer of suffering. This additional layer of suffering is the suffering of God. Yes, God. But not the suffering of God on the cross. Rather, it is the suffering of God the parent who experiences the death of this child. It is not that death in any element of the created order does not touch God, move God. But this is different. Parents who have lost their children will often say, "A part of me died that day." That is not simply a literal truth of biology. It is also about the way in which one's life is reoriented every day because there now exists a void where your child once was. God is no different from us here. God is not impassively watching the crucifixion unfold. God is also suffering on the account of it. But Paul tells us something extraordinary. In that suffering of God is love. It is a love for us who are also suffering, whether or not we see ourselves that way all the time. Why love? How is this love? It is because love is where connection happens. Love is the link between God and humanity, and it is made manifest in this awfulest of moments. This loss, this displacement, this absolute turn of the world and eternity on its axis is where God connects to humans most fully, most deeply, most completely. It is a stunning statement. Let's look at it one last time. I have the actual translation from the New Revised Standard Version up here, but let me read you my amplified version of it. While we are at our most vulnerable, at just the right time, the eternal and the human come together. In spite of what is often a refusal to show reverence for God or the things of God, Christ dies for us. It is not because we are worthy in any way of such a sacrifice. It is precisely because we are in such deep need. And God, being God, knows that. And God loves us in spite of our weaknesses, our impiousness, and our sinfulness. Indeed, it is in all of this suffering that God's love is made known. It is a love that expresses how God suffers with us on the cross and on account of us because we need something to set us right with God. But God is also suffering watching God's child die. That is, the relationship between God and Christ is being changed in this moment, even as God is embracing us with love through this death. To my mind, this passage encapsulates everything that we confess about who God is and what God is about. It is brief, it is dense, but I hope in standing back from it, both taking it apart, looking at each of the pieces, putting it back together again, and thinking about all of the things that are going on within it and around it and underneath it. It has explicated some things for you that you might not otherwise have seen. We will again continue next week as we move through the book of Romans.